tell you what the schedule at this moment. Okay, if you check the schedule, you'll see that we're supposed to be covering the Ramayana today. We had started with that on Friday, and I just want to let you know very briefly what the agenda is for the week, so that you can think ahead, plan accordingly. The reading is definitely going to start to go down after this week, because we're going to be finished with the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. And in fact, actually, there's going to be a week, I think sometime around week 6, when the reading is going to be really very, very marginal. So, I think you're going to be done with the bulk of the reading, as this kind of reading at least, at the end of this week, if you haven't already done so. But the agenda essentially is going to be, we continue with the discussion of the Ramayana. I'm going to start talking about the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. You're not reading excerpts from that, but you need to know something about that. These systems of Indian philosophy, as they're called, the Mahabharata, the Bhagavad Gita, and finally, probably on Friday, the political history of India, which we had sort of covered until Ashoka, as you might recall. Right, so that took us to about 230 BCE, and we're going to do the next 700 years, roughly, going until about somewhere around the 300, 400, 500 AD, right? So about 600-700 years. I'm going to sort of talk about that this week as well. And so that's essentially what the agenda is for the week. Now, in my concluding remarks to you on Friday, I had been discussing with you the nature of the RAMKatha, right? And the RAMKatha, let me reiterate, is the story of Ram. And then there are various tellings of, the Ram story. And some of these tellings are very controversial, extremely controversial. They need not be. And they need not be controversial because what I've been trying to impress upon you is the fact that there are many communities in South Asia, manifold communities, and they have different interpretations and different readings of the Ram story. And there's no reason why that shouldn't be the case. Now, some of those stories and versions may not agree with what Hindus have grown up with, especially, for example, people who belong to the faith and who believe that there is a certain version of the Ramayana. I myself come from the Hindu faith. Whether I'm a practitioner or not is a different matter, but I know what the dominant version is, and the dominant version is the version where Ram is married to Sita. Ram is the ideal king. Well, there may be a few flaws here and there, which the Kamban Ramayana, for example, indicates. In some places, he's known more as a king, but largely he's worshipped as a deity, as one of the avatars of Vishnu, right? And then you have his loyal aide, shall we say, Hanuman. There's an interesting question. Why is the person who's most loyal to him depicted in the form of a monkey, right? Why not in the form of a human? And it may be partly because the suggestion is that if a monkey is capable of such levels of devotion, imagine how much more devoted a human being could be, possibly, right? Because, of course, what distinguishes a human being from animals is the faculty of reason, right? The faculty to distinguish between good and evil, between bad and wrong, and so forth and so on. That's what distinguishes human beings from animals, right? And so if you look at the Bhagavad Gita, which we're going to be covering either today or on Wednesday, the first line of the Bhagavad Gita is Dharma Kshetre Kurukshetre, which is on the land of Dharma, on the land of the Kurus. The Kurus are the Kauravas. For those who've read the Mahabharata, you know who they are. So you've got the Kauravas and the Pandavas, right? But why is it on the land of Dharma? Because the author is already signifying that he is speaking to human beings, and he's speaking about a realm, Dharma, on the land of Dharma. And you've encountered this word already now. I've spoken about it in several lectures, right? Law, morality, conduct, and large parts of the Ramayana and large parts of the Mahabharata are about the nature of Dharma. Okay? So now what I'm suggesting to you is this, that if you look at the character of Hanuman, for example, right, there's an interesting set of questions to be asked. Why is it that, as I said, he is the ultimate paragon, the ultimate exemplar of devotion? Right? In fact, there is a very famous representation, visual representation, and you'll see some of these on Wednesday when I show you some slides of how the stories of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata have been displayed in Indian culture. Right? What are the kinds of visual representations? Has the visual representation of Ram changed, for example, over a long period of time? So there's one very famous visual representation of Hanuman where he bears open his chest, and when he bears open his chest, you see Ram and Sita inscribed in it. You know, okay? Yes?
Is there any tradition of namesaking people for characters, using the characters of the Ramayana and
Any tradition of doing what, sorry?
Of naming people.
Naming people. How do you mean naming people?
Naming people. Rama, Sita, Hanuman. Are those names that are commonly...
Are people named after?
Exactly.
Oh, a Ram, yeah. I mean, there are probably 1 million Rams in India, probably 1 million. Yeah, I mean, I probably in my circle can think of, nowadays it's not common. And Sita, very common. I mean, there was a Hindi film called Sita or Gita. Sita and Gita. I mean, it's but usually people do not take the name of Hanuman. That's not that common, but it's not unusual. But Ram, Sita, Krishna, very common. Very, very common. Yeah. Yeah. That might be another way, by the way, of, perhaps saying that there is a continuum. Remember that I was speaking about the continuum between the asuras, the demons, the demi-gods, the gods, humans, right? But of course, one reason why perhaps the character who is the most loyal and devoted to Ram is Hanuman is because human beings have an ego which prevent them from giving themselves completely unto another person. When you give yourself completely to another person, you expect to be reciprocated, right? You expect some kind of reciprocation. I mean, even perhaps a mother's love for her infant, even she perhaps, if she, you might say that love is unconditional, but I doubt that, frankly, because if the baby never smiled at the mother, for a year, I think the mother might begin to think that, well, is the baby really deserving of my love all the time? Right? Okay? But here the love is absolutely unconditional, and maybe that's why the exemplar of this devotion is Hanuman, because human beings have an ego, ahamkara, as they say, okay, in Sanskrit. But now I'm saying to you, let's go back to the first point before we get into some more detail of the story, that the RAMKatha is a story, and then there are many tellings of it, and some are controversial. Why are they controversial? Because in some versions of the Ramayana, Ravan is the hero. Ravan is a hero. I mean, after all, look at it this way, that he takes Sita into captivity, and she spends years with him in captivity, right? And he doesn't violate her sexually. Now, he may want to, and there is a curse, that there is a curse that if he should try to violate her sexually, he's going to be burnt to ashes. So you might say, well, he's sort of pragmatic about it, right? Right? But on the other hand, what's the point of holding her in captivity then, right? If you're going to violate her, right? What's the point of it then, right? So Ravan is a person who has enormous powers of devotion himself. He's a follower of Shiva. You remember I mentioned to you that one way to read the Ramayana is to read it within the history of sectarianism. That Ravan is a devotee of Shiva and Ram is an avatar of Vishnu. And there's a clash over there. That's one way to read it. And I'm not saying that that's the dominant way to read it or necessarily the most desirable way to read it, but I'm just giving you an illustration of some of the kinds of complexities that come about. But in all the versions of the Ramayana, we do know that Ravan, even though he's the demon, and ultimately he's going to be annihilated by Ram, that he is shown in some respects in glowing terms. Now, in some places in India, Ravan is celebrated, not Ram. There are other versions where Sita is cast as the sibling of Ram, not as a wife of Ram, as a spouse of Ram. And this, so the Hindu nationalists become very agitated. It's so agitated, let me give you an illustration, that last year at the University of Delhi, there is an essay by a man whose name I've mentioned to you in my previous lecture, one of the great 20th century interpreters of Indian literature, Ramanujan, A K Ramanujan, the man who wrote this Poems of Love and War, right? Now, or translations of old Tamil poems. Now, A K Ramanujan wrote an essay which is about the 300 different Ramayans in India. And he shows you the variations that you find. And some of the Hindu nationalists got so agitated that they demanded, this actually incident goes back to 4 years ago, when they demanded that this article be removed from the syllabus because it was being taught. And they went to the history department where it was being taught, and they smashed the doors and windows, okay, locked up the department, and physically beat up a couple of the faculty. Now, last year, so of course, what the university did is what all such organizations do when they want to deflect such thing, right? This is what they do in America too. You appoint a committee of inquiry. When you appoint a committee, you know that nothing's going to happen. It's going to just, put it in cold storage for some years and hope it gets buried away. So they appointed a committee, and the committee took several years, and then they finally came out with a recommendation saying that the essay ought to be, in fact, actually banned. Okay? The history department unanimously voted to oppose that. They wanted to teach the essay, as indeed it should be taught. I'm giving it to you in a capsule form. Now, these things are very controversial, right? But why should they be? Because we need to understand the nature of that civilization, that there are many different interpretations, and all of these are equally a legitimate part of the history, the literary, cultural history of that country. Okay? Now, secondly, before I move into the text, I want to reinforce something I'd said again, because remember that I had concluded my remarks with the discussion of the Ram Janamsthan Babri Masjid episode. Right? Remember this mosque that was destroyed? And why was it destroyed? By Hindu nationalists and their political patrons, because such acts are not possible without political patronage. I mean, you've got the police standing by, you've got the state standing by, you've got the Supreme Court orders saying that you cannot touch this disputed structure, as it came to be known in official language, and yet tens of thousands of people gather there and physically dismantle this whole structure. That's only possible when you have political patronage. Right? Now, these Hindu nationalists had argued that this was the exact spot at which Ram was born. The exact spot. And that there used to be a temple dedicated to him, and this temple was destroyed, and then a mosque was built. Now, in abstract, it is possible to believe, because that's the nature of the politics of conquest, in the abstract, it is possible to believe that there may have been temples that were destroyed when the Muslims came to India. That's quite likely. We should accept that. Whether there was a particular temple here is a different matter. And then it's also a different matter, why is it that everybody started becoming interested in showing that Ram is a historical deity, much in the way in which Jesus is a historical person, or Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, is a historical person. So there's a kind of anxiety that developed among Hindus that our deities are not historical deities. They're all sort of shrouded in myth. And as I mentioned to you, myth is a word that has now acquired almost entirely pejorative connotations in the English language. And to reinforce this point, that what is at the heart of the problem here is the tendency to want to historicize, Hinduism, historicize our deities. I want to turn your attention for a second to what I've written over there, the two Krishnas that you find in the Indian tradition. And again, to liven this up a little bit, on Wednesday I'll show you some slides of both of these Krishnas. Okay? So what are these two Krishnas? And why does this matter become so important of who the two Krishnas are? Turn your mind for a moment to the late 19th century. Second half of the 19th century, British rule has been firmly established in India for well over 100 years. And Indian nationalism is now slowly coming to the fore. Indian nationalists are beginning to ponder over a question. And that question was, why is it that we as a people have always been enslaved by foreigners? We're now under British rule. We've been under British rule for over 100 years. Before this, we were under Muslim rule. Whether Muslims ought to be viewed as foreigners or not, considering that they'd been in India for, at this point, 800-900 years, is a different matter. Let's just provisionally go along with that argument, right? Hypothetically, that yes, let's assume that they were foreigners for a second. So this is a question that begins to animate the mind of Indian nationalists. They're wondering, why are we always enslaved? Now, an Indian writer by the name of Bankimcandra Chatterjee is going to come along. And again, he's an illustration. He's not the only one here who's making this kind of argument, but he is, I think, the best illustration of the kind of argument that I'm suggesting here. So he comes along, and he says the problem with Indians, and with Hindus in particular, because he's concerned here so there's an elision here. Indians and Hindus become kind of synonymous. Why have we Indians means why have we Hindus, right? Who from his standpoint and from the standpoint of many had come to define the essential features of Indian civilization, right? Okay? Going back to the time of the Aryans, right? And then for 3 millennia after that. So for him, the answer is simple, that number one, we Hindus are too much into spiritual devotion. We don't pay enough attention to the material world. Okay? We don't have a proper religion, frankly. What is a proper religion? A proper religion, now he's not going to say it in so many words, but in effect, that's what it's going to mean. A proper religion is a Semitic religion, because it needs to have a historical founder. We need to have one book that all practitioners of the faith believe in. The problem with Hindus is they've got millions of gods and goddesses, right? They've got thousands of holy books, and there's no agreement on which is the book which is to be read by everybody and which is authoritative for everybody. No agreement whatsoever, right? They don't have a single place. I mean, Islam has its Mecca and Medina. Well, Hinduism has got hundreds of places of pilgrimage. I mean, in fact, one way to think about India, by the way, just as a little footnote, you know, if somebody said, how do you define India? Well, India is a land of pilgrimages. That's one definition of India. I mean, there are untold number of religious pilgrimages that you can take in India, because the sacred geography is such that no matter where you go, every 2 kilometers that you go, there's some spot that is sacred. Either Ram came here and had a drink of water, or Sita came, or Krishna came, or Hanuman came, right? And 14 years of exile is a long period of time. You're wandering all over the land. I mean, literally. I mean, you just go into the Himalayan area, and every kilometer there's a place where the locals will tell you Ram and Sita came here, or Hanuman came here, and it becomes part of the sacred geography. There are thousands of places of pilgrimage. Of course, some are more important than others. No question about that. I'm not saying that there isn't a hierarchy, right? But you see, it's a religion from his standpoint, not from my standpoint. I hope you understand that. I'm not telling you what my reading is. That from his standpoint, it's a religion of utter confusion, right? Multiplicity. And you find that even in a single God can be known by 1,000 names. That's true. One God can be known by 1,000 names. And then they might have myriad forms, right? I mean, so it's extraordinarily diverse, complex. It's like what I call the World Wide Web, with millions of nodal points and thousands of websites and millions of websites. I mean, the World Wide Web is anticipated in the nodal configurations of Hinduism. You know, right? Now Bankimcandra Chatterjee comes along and he says, all right, let's look at our God called Krishna. Remember, he's the other great avatar of Vishnu, right? Now, there is a tradition of Krishna who is a god. And mind you, we're not speaking about a minor god. I mean, Krishna and Ram and Shiva are the major deities. So there's one little irony here, that Ram and Krishna are the avatars. They're the incarnations of Vishnu. But actually their worship is greater in some ways than the worship of Vishnu himself in some ways, even though they derive from him in a way. Okay? Now, he says, let's look at the god Krishna. If you read a book called the Bhagavatam, all right, it is also known as the Bhagavatam, Bhagavata Purana. Okay, so sorry. It's also known as a Bhagavata Purana. Remember I was talking to you about the Puranas? Right, so this is one of the many Puranas. And this is a Vaishnava Purana, and it's a Vaishnava Purana because it elevates the God Vishnu and his incarnations. Now, Book 10 of the Bhagavatam, Book 10 of the Bhagavatam, also known as the Bhagavata Purana, is a life of the God Krishna. But it's not the kind of life that you think you're going to get. I mean, it doesn't tell you that he was born in, Vrindavan, in this house, lane number 28, house number 14, in 2822 BC or whatever. No. What it basically describes is a mythic world. In this mythic world, okay, what are the kinds of activities that the God Krishna is engaged in? One of the activities he's engaged in as a little child is the theft of butter. So he's called Makhan Chor. For those of you who know Hindu, you'll immediately recognize Makhan Chor is the person who steals butter. That's one of the many ways by which he's known, because as a young infant, as a young boy, Krishna loves butter, right? And his mother is constantly hiding the butter everywhere, but no matter where it is. So if she puts it up on a shelf, he'll stand on a stool, he'll get a stick, right? Now this is how God spends his time. The other way he spends his time is running around after women, literally. Okay? I mean, he's engaged in what's called Krishna Lila, right? And there are these women, they're called gopis. And if you look at paintings of, the gopis, so gopis are the cowherdesses, because Krishna is actually a cowherd. He brings the cows back home. He takes them out grazing, and then he brings them back home in the evening. He's a cowherd, right? But he's also God. We'll consider some of these complexities in greater detail when we get to the Bhagavad Gita and the life of Krishna. But here I'm giving you an illustration of what are the stories about Krishna. And one of the most famous stories is the story of the Vastraharana. You don't have to worry about the name. For those of you who know Sanskrit or Hindi, you'd recognize Vastraharana, which is the theft of the clothes. What does he do? He goes to the banks of the river where the gopis are taking a bath, right? And they've shed their clothes, they've gone into the water, they're taking a bath. He goes there on the sly, and they put all their clothes in a little heap on the banks of the river. He steals all these clothes. Then he goes up and climbs on the top of a tree. Now, when they finish their bath, they are about to come out of the river, and they find, hey, our clothes aren't there. And then Krishna whistles to them from the top of the tree. Come get your clothes, right? Now, Bankim says, what kind of God is this? I mean, he's spending all his time dallying with women. He's a butter thief, right? Okay. He's stealing clothes. He's having a good time, right? I mean, is this supposed to be God? God is supposed to be somebody who sets moral standards, and we're supposed to emulate these moral standards. So Bankim gets very disturbed. And he says, you can't write a biography of this God. I mean, a God is somebody like Jesus Christ, right, in effect. Right? So what he wants to do is, he wants to suggest, but there is another tradition of Krishna, which is what we can call the historical tradition of Krishna, where we can say that, there is a different Krishna. There are two different kinds of Krishnas, right? I mean, think of it this way. This is not a perfect analogy, but if you're thinking, what does this mean, the two Krishnas? Just think of it this way, just momentarily. I mean, if you look at the life of Christ, you could say that there are many different ways to interpret him, but one is to look at the Sermon on the Mount, and to look at somebody who, essentially, if you read the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5-7, now there he's going to say things like, if someone hits you on one cheek, turn the other cheek to him. If he takes your coat, give your cloak, etc., right? Passive resistance, as would be interpreted. But there's another tradition which shows Christ as somebody who's, a very determined kind of leader. He's not simply a shepherd leading his flock, right? I mean, so if you look at an Italian filmmaker by the name of Pasolini, I mean, he made a film called The Gospel According to St. Matthew, which is a dramatic Marxist kind of interpretation where Christ is like Lenin, you know, right, leading the vanguard. Now that's two different kinds of readings of Christ. So what Bankim is saying here now is that there is a historical Krishna. This is the Krishna of the Bhagavad Gita, because this is the person who's now going to give advice to Arjuna. And for those of you who've read the Mahabharata, right, he is going to engage in all kinds of cunning, political intrigue in order to ensure the victory of the Pandavas in the Mahabharata. This is a bit more like God, somebody who ensures that the good side wins over the bad side, right? We don't want a God who's, as I said, dallying around with women, frolicking on the green, right? That's not the kind of God we want. So this is the mythic God, and then there's the historical, the mythic Krishna versus the historical Krishna. Now, this argument is going to be taken much further by Hindu nationalists in the 20th century, who are now going to try to historicize. They're going to try to, in a sense, eviscerate, wipe out the mythic Krishna, who is by far the most dominant version of the Krishna in the Indian legend, even today, notwithstanding all the efforts of the Hindu nationalists. The vast amounts of devotional poetry, literature, painting, they are all about the Krishna and the gopis, the Krishna Lila, the Krishna who's a butter thief, so forth and so on. I mean, highly lovable character, you know, right? Okay, so this is the context that we have to think about when we try to understand the argument I'm making to you, that the problem here has to do with trying to historicize our religion. And why did we begin to feel that we had to historicize our religion? I've given you one reason. The other reason, of course, is, which is implicit in the argument, but now I need to state it explicitly, that a proper nation state has a proper history, that we Hindus do not have a sense of history. Bankim is going to say that. If we have a sense of history, we will be proud of certain elements of our past. And he has this wonderful passage where he says, you know, the Hindus did all these great things and never bothered to even write about them. They invented the zero, they did this, and nobody even bothered to record it. He says, by contrast, the Englishman sneezes and he writes about it in his diary, and then it becomes literature. You know? Right? This is the contrast between how devoted the English are to themselves, and the English is a metaphor for the West here as a whole, right? Know that each person thinks his life is unique. Thus you get all these autobiographies, right, today, you know, of Tom, Dick, and Harry, just because they did this or that for 15 minutes, right? Okay? And the Hindu, you know, has written the greatest epics in the world, has performed surgeries in 500 BCE, but he is not even remotely interested in writing the history of his own past. Okay? So that a powerful nation state needs a sense of history, and now we are going to have to create this history. We're going to have to create the sense of history among Indians. This is what you need to know to understand why 30 years ago, 25 years ago, suddenly people start to become highly agitated about this 16th century mosque and start to claim, some of them, that this was the exact spot where Ram was born. All right, now that's one way to look at the whole thing. We haven't actually looked at the text very much, so I want to point your attention to a few things in the text as well, you know, right? So for example, on page 63, 64, for those of you who have, you know, the book, right, you can sort of look at it. If you look at the end of it, I'll give you a few illustrations. I've already actually spoken about some things here. For example, why is Hanuman, right, the ultimate exemplar of devotion? But there's an interesting debate that takes place, right? The debate is, whose authority is the highest? If you have a guru and you have a set of parents, because teachers are meant to be venerated in this tradition. They're meant to be venerated. I mean, in village India, still even the school teacher, the primary school teacher, in principle is a venerated figure, because the whole idea is that we grow up and we receive instruction, and this is how we evolve. This is how we develop, how we mature and bloom, right? Now, if your father says, on the other hand, parents are to be venerated as well, right? The king is to be venerated because the king represents a supreme political authority. So how are these competing centers of authority to be reconciled if they're different views? So if you turn to the bottom of 63, Ram shook his head and said, yes, 14 years hence, that was our father's wish. You are the king by his authority, right? He's saying this to Bharat, because remember that Kaikeyi has been able to influence Dashratha to send Ram into exile, right? And why does that happen? Well, she wants her own son, right, to become the king, okay? And she says, you had conferred these two boons on me. So there are such devices as curses, vows, boons. Boon is a blessing, right? Okay? A gift, more appropriately. These are going to occur in epic literature all the time. If, I put a curse on you if you don't do such and such thing, and then you need to deflect the power of that curse, right? These are very important in this worldview. So Ram says to Bharat, well, now, it's our father's wish that you should become the king, and I'm going into exile. If you think I should be the king, so be it. But I abdicate this instant and crown you. Now that's interesting. So Bharat says, all right, I'll become the king, but now as a king, I'm abdicating my crown and I'm giving it back to you, right? Because that's the king's authority. But of course, that isn't going to get us anywhere, because that means that, in effect, Kaikeyi's wish cannot be fulfilled. The argument went on at a highly academic and philosophical level, the entire assembly watching with respect. In a world where we are accustomed, now that's the other point of this whole episode, in a world where we are accustomed to rivalries over possession, authority and borders, and people clashing over the issue, ours or mine, not yours, right? Where everybody is greedy to get a share of the spoils, it is rather strange to find two people debating whose the kingdom is not, and asserting yours, not mine. So be it. If I have the authority, then I confer it on you as a ruler, said Bharat at one stage. On my command as a ruler, if you desire to think so, you shall be the king. It went on thus. Ram went on repeating that there could be no word higher than that of a father, no conduct other than obedience to it. Throughout, he referred to Kaikeyi in the gentlest terms and always as mother. Vashisht, watching the debate, burst out, I have been your guru. There can be no higher authority than a guru. Right? I've been your teacher. You must return to Ayodhya as king. Ram said, it's not right to give me that command. My parents, who have given me my body and mind, are higher than a guru. Right? This is what I meant. You've got competing centers of authority. It tells you something about the nature of that culture, right? Who is held in veneration? What might be some of the kinds of debates that followed because of the differences of opinion that develop over here? Let me give you another interesting illustration of the kind of thing you might want to think about in the text. The very controversial, extremely controversial episode nearly towards the end of the Agni Pariksha. Right? What is the Agni Pariksha? See, the Agni Pariksha is the test by fire. Remember so Agni here is fire, okay? Agni appears as a god in the Vedas. Pariksha is examination or test. So what is the Agni Pariksha? That when Ravan has been annihilated and then Ram returns to Ayodhya in triumph with Sita, shortly after that, he says to Sita, you shall have to now undergo the Agni Pariksha, the trial by fire. Why should she have to undergo the trial by fire? And what is a trial by fire? That if she sits in the midst of a fire, she will emerge from it unscathed. Why should she have to do that? Because if she is able to emerge unscathed, it will be a sign of her purity. Right? A sign of her purity. Well, why should she have to show that she's pure? Right? Because there is some doubt about whether she was chaste and pure all the time that she was with Ravan. Right? I mean, after all, she lived in his palace, in his captivity for years. Right? So was she chaste? Was she pure? Was she ever tempted? Now, this is a real problem, because Sita's word should be good enough. I mean, Sita is, of course, pure as, the snow that falls before it gets muddy when the cars start going over it, right? I mean, she is the emblem of purity, right, in this culture. So why should she have to? I mean, she has said that, hey, I was pure not just in body, but in mind. I never had any thought about Ravan. That should be good enough. It should be. Particularly for a husband who is supposed to be the deity and a paragon of human goodness. So now this is a problem. And the interpreters have to worry about this. Does this show that, well, Ram was basically just like every other man, i.e. sexist, right? Was that really the problem here? That he simply couldn't accept her word, right? And women have to be pure. Let's not worry about men don't have to be pure. They're basically free to do whatever they want. But men have to be pure because they represent the nation. Right? They represent the culture. They are the embodiments of the culture. Right? So this becomes a problem for the interpreters because it shows Ram in a bad light in some ways. That he doesn't trust his wife. On the other hand, there's a different school of interpretation which says that, no. Ram was actually, we have to understand that he's not only a husband to Sita, he's also the king. Which means that as a husband, he might actually believe entirely what Sita says. But he has a larger responsibility to his subjects. And why does he have to have Sita go through the Agni Pariksha? Because there are rumors. There are rumors going around in the city that Ram has Sita as his wife, but we don't know if Sita is pure or not. We don't know if she was violated or not. Now he has to satisfy these, he has to quell these rumors, negate them. Because if these rumors continue, it will create dissent. It will create disorder in that society. So he has a function as a king, which he has to fulfill. Whatever his sentiments might be as a husband. Now that's, I think, a reasonably convincing interpretation. But you see, this is what we mean. That the text here is open to interpretation. We cannot say that the character of Ram is necessarily completely flawless. And if it is not necessarily flawless, then why is he held up as the example of an ideal monogamous king, deity, lover, husband? All of that. Right? Because of course there are these other interpretations like the one that I've just given you, which explain why he might undertake actions which otherwise do not appear to be reasonable. Why did he take the side of Sugriv, right, in the contest between Sugriv and Bali? Right? Why did he take his side? Right? Because the evidence is not compelling. And he didn't permit the other side to air their views. Now, if you are going to adjudicate a dispute between two parties, the reasonable way to do it is to make sure that you give an equal hearing to both sides of the conflict. Did he do that? Right? In the debate, in the conflict that arises, you have to have read the Ramayana for you to know what I'm talking about here, obviously, and I can't go over the episode. But this is, of course, the issue that comes up in the case of Sugriv and Bali, right? And so on. So this is where I think the text now starts to become really lively and interesting, is when you start thinking about it in this way. What is the nature of dharma? That's another way in which you can view. If you look at the Agni Pariksha, Ram has his dharma as a husband, right? The dharma is what you must do. Remember I told you that even a snake has a dharma. The snake's dharma is to hiss. The dog's dharma is to bark, right? And human beings have their dharma. Now we'll have to understand the complexity of that as we move into the Mahabharata as well, because in the case of human beings, the nature of the dharma may be difficult to decipher at times. Because dharma is what you ought to be doing, what is right. And there are times when we don't know what is right. Right? So his dharma as a husband was to accept what Sita says to him. But his dharma as a king is to be attentive to his subjects. Be attentive to larger questions. Don't let your attachment with your wife, is the argument. Don't let your attachment to your wife blind you to your much larger responsibilities towards society as a whole. Right? And so we could say, in fact, that Ram was acting as a yogi in some ways. All right? Detached. Right? And this brings me then to the subject of yoga. Okay, before we move to the Mahabharata, which we'll do on Wednesday, the Mahabharata and the Bhagavad Gita. But I need to lay the grounds for this. Okay? That brings me, as I said, to the subject of yoga. Now, all of you have heard of yoga. And today, of course, in America, it's inescapable. I mean, there are even people who have patented it. Bikram yoga, for example, right? It's quite popular. There's actually, various schools of yoga, various schools of interpretation. And what does the word mean? When did the idea of yoga arise? Of course, we know that yoga arose in India. There's no disputing that, right? And there's a text called the Yoga Sutras, right, by Patanjali, generally dated to about something like 200 CE, somewhere around that time, or 200 AD, right? Although the kernel of this text almost certainly goes back much further, much further. Okay, and again, there's a reference in the Rig Veda to the idea of the yogi. We know that there are Indus Valley seals. I had mentioned that to you. I showed you one, okay, which shows a person in postures of a yogi. Okay, so the idea goes, which is why sometimes we can take up I could have taken up yoga 2 lectures ago, right? But then we have to see when the thoughts began to crystallize, roughly. Okay, so I would say that perhaps sometime around the 300 BCE, the thoughts about this began to crystallize. Then it took perhaps a couple of 100 years, 300-400 years maybe, for it to then become condensed into a text, which is then attributed to a man called Patanjali. Okay, we don't really know much about him. Some people think, actually, by the way, that he is the same person who wrote the Mahabhashya, which is the grammar of Panini. But there was also a Patanjali who was a grammarian. Okay, right? And one thing I want to insist upon right now is the idea of the singular author has not emerged yet. Very, very important. Right? Because you might always wonder, well, who are these people? Valmiki, Vyasa, Patanjali, Panini, Vedas, of course, we don't even know. Upanishads, we don't know. That's quite different, by the way, from the Western tradition, where if you go back to the 6th century BCE, well, there's a work called the Histories, and there's somebody called Herodotus. And then 100 years later, you've got Thucydides, right? And, there's a kind of a notion of the singular author is already much better developed in the West. In India, you don't really have the idea of the singular author. There's Vyasa. The Mahabharata is supposed to have been written by a man called Vyasa. Well, you know how big the Mahabharata is, right? I told you it's 7 times the size of the Iliad and the Odyssey put together. I doubt that any one person called Vyasa wrote the Mahabharata, particularly because almost certainly it was put together over a period of 5 or 6 centuries. It's not possible that, of the idea of the singular author to have emerged in this culture. And Vyasa is also there, by the way, another 100 books attributed to Vyasa. So unless he had 6 hands like an Indian god and was writing 24 hours a day, right, it couldn't have been somebody called Vyasa who wrote all of these works. And you don't need to worry about that. You're not going to be asked a question which says, who's the author of the Mahabharata, who's the author of the Yoga Sutras, right? Identify each of them, right? No, that's not what we're interested in here. What we're interested in is that the idea of the singular author has not emerged at all. Right? And this also means that we have to understand the idea of subjectivity, the idea of the self, had these emerged in the same way or not. So now we go back to the Yoga Sutras, and the Yoga Sutras are a series of aphorisms. It's a very short work. I mean, this book here, 80% of this is commentary. Okay, the actual work is aphorisms. Sutras are like little lines. Okay, I'm just going to read out the first 4, and then I'll talk a little bit more about it. I think we're running out of time almost, but I just want to begin with this here. The nature of yoga. The first 4 aphorisms of this text. This is the teaching of yoga. Yoga is the cessation of the turnings of thought. Cessation means end. The mind is always churning, isn't it? Right now you're listening to me, but you're probably thinking about something else too. Almost certainly. Right? Whatever that might be. Maybe the next lunch, the next TV show, who knows? Maybe, what cell messages you've had in the last 50 minutes that you haven't been able to check, right? Right? The mind is constantly churning, and to be devoted steadfastly to one thing is a very difficult task. Yoga as a cessation. So what is yoga supposed to do? Is a cessation of the turnings of thought. It's not about postures, right? You see the difference already? It doesn't say anything about postures. I mean, in America, yoga is basically what is called hatha yoga, which is postures or asanas, right? Asanas. So what kind of asanas you should do, right? That might make your body flexible. And I'm not saying, by the way, that is unimportant. Please don't mistake me to mean that. Asanas. And what you have basically in America is what is called hatha yoga. But the first 4 aphorisms of this book, I've only read 2, do not say anything about the asanas or postures. They say yoga is a definition here for you. It's a cessation of the turnings of thought. Aphorism 3, when thought ceases, is that possible? Right? Well, I mean, it's possible for, class of people who might be brain dead to begin with, but that we're not thinking of that. When thought ceases, the spirit stands in its true identity as observer to the world. Right? Amazing. I mean, what the author is really trying to get at. Otherwise, aphorism 4, the observer identifies with the turnings of thought. Okay? So, when thought ceases, so you have to still your mind. Absolutely still your mind. Not just the body, still your mind. The spirit stands in its true identity as observer to the world. Right? There's something beyond thought, and there's a kind of a interesting, that it's almost like you looking upon yourself as the observer, but as spirit, and deflecting thought altogether. Okay? But I'll expound on this in greater detail on Wednesday. Right? So we're going to do a little bit of the Yoga Sutras and move on to the Mahabharata. So be sure you've read the Mahabharata when you come to class on Wednesday.